Hi, and welcome to Thrive.com. That's Thrive with 3 I's.com. My name is Dana Gorman, and I am the founder of DefeatAutismYesterday.com, which became the mother of Thrive with 3I's.com. This particular presentation I've been doing for a couple of years now. I started giving it at Autism 1, 2006, and for this particular version of it, I gave it at Dr. Klinghart's Autism Conference in August of 2008, and I titled it Putting the Pieces Together. It's also known as What I Wish I Had Known and Understood About Autism when I started my journey, wow, 7 years ago. This presentation has been made possible by my son's journey with autism. His name is Kellen. His nickname is Gecko, and he is perfect. And I know when I say the word perfect about a child with autism, there's probably a few people that will celebrate because they believe that to be true about their child. And there's probably some listening to this that will cringe at that because they think of the poop that they've cleaned off the walls and the sleepless nights and the sheer and utter exhaustion. And it's hard for them to place that in the same category with perfection. But I believe that we're all on the journey that we're intended to be on. I think it's much harder in a lot of ways than having neurotypical children, but I believe my son to be perfect, and we'll go from there. I'm celebrating his perfection, but recognizing his neurotoxicity is keeping him from thriving. What I'd like for you to look at in this particular picture is his photo on the left. You can see he knows where he's going. You can see that he has a clear image of what he's looking at and where he wants to go and how he's processing things. In the picture on the right, you can see neurotoxicity. You may not have looked for it before, but you can see a clear inflammation above his nose, below his eyes, the droopy lower lip. Everything about that photo is indicative of neurotoxicity. You could add to that photo dark circles under the eye, and that would be indicative. There's a lot of things you could add, but I think this sort of spells it out a little bit. And I think if you start looking at your child's or the person you're trying to have thrive's face, it's going to be such a great indicator for your success or failure trying to do a protocol designed for them to thrive. The goal of recovery and cure challenge his perfection. And I'm going to tell you why these two words are troublesome for me. The word recovery is a problem for me because I think every time I've heard somebody say, oh yeah, my son's recovered from autism, I hear at least half a dozen people say, oh, have you seen your son? Oh, so not recovered. And that's a nasty reality, but I think if you recognize that and you really think about it, and you believe in quantum physics, which is nothing more, well, it's a lot, but it's really the power of word and the power of thought. And if you say it, it becomes the truth type of reality. You won't want all those people saying that your child is not doing well. That's my challenge with the word recovery. My challenge with the word cure is that as soon as you say the word cure, your brain immediately goes to the area of your brain that's been bought and paid for by the pharmaceutical industry, which wants a pill to fix it all. And that's what cure conjures up. So if you can get away from the concept of cure and start to embrace the idea of your child thriving, I think the net result will be a much healthier and better situation for your child, and they'll just get better faster, is my belief. First, we do know what causes autism. We know what causes autism. And at the bottom there's a list of the people that have been at some of the summits, 2, 3, and then at 4, and then I added Dr. Gary Gordon to that list. We know what causes autism. And what I mean by that is everything you've ever heard causes autism is in fact part of the causal cluster of autism. It's when you try to say it's only one of those things that you start to create all these problems and all these debates and all of this energy wasted on everything but creating the situation for these kids to thrive. Anything that's keeping them from thriving is part of why they continue with their diagnosis of autism, is my belief and the belief of all the people who came to our summits. This process has resulted in us having regular summits out at geckoranch.org, which is a ranch that we bought and created for our son to thrive. And I originally wanted to have it be a boarding school for special needs kids where the parents could come with the child and they could learn everything that they need to learn and watch their child thrive and then go home and repeat the process. That didn't happen. What happened was my son moved out there, and the next thing you know, I started having these summits. They were very popular. People call me all the time and ask me when the next one is going to be. We've had 4 so far. We have another one scheduled for February 2009, and this is what it looks like. This is some of the people that are amazingly helpful to the process. That's Dr. Klinghardt with his hands up there. Second, people with autism begin to thrive every day. And what I mean by that is I really firmly believe that you can take a child that looks severely autistic and you can change their environment in a way that creates a situation for them to thrive, and you will physically watch them change. Before your eyes, you will see their behavior patterns change. That's my belief system. I'm saying thrive versus recover because children will remain neurodiverse after neurotoxin-induced ill health is resolved, and thank God for that. I'm neurodiverse. You're neurodiverse. One of my favorite things to say is not, oh, wow, is he on the spectrum? But rather, where are you on the spectrum? Where am I on the spectrum? Because I look at the autism spectrum, and I include ADD and ADHD and all of those things on it, and I don't think of it as being anything other than neurotoxic overload. And I think about those people driving home on the freeway right now because it's about 5:30 in LA, and you can't tell me that there's not a certain percentage of those people that are getting so stressed out, they're going from being neurotypical to autistic. By the time they get home, they're going to be screaming at their kids. And so, and the shouldivaccinate.com is just one of the satellite sites to thrive.com designed to help you with a lively debate about the options associated with vaccination. I'm saying people versus children because there is no age limit for the damage from neurotoxicity to be reversed. If you hang out with the neurologists that think that brain damage is a permanent situation, then you will be sold the concept that if you miss the crucial window before the age of 3, the brain loses its plasticity and you can't be one of the lucky ones anymore. And I think it's just bunk. The reality is every single person that I know that has been helpful to kids with brain injuries, because usually it's not just autism, it's cerebral palsy, it's quadriplegia, it's post-polio syndrome, completely believe there is no age limit and that the brain is completely plastic and will reroute around damaged areas the rest of your life. So get the notion that there's an age limit for this neurotoxicity to be reversed. The URUnited.com was a site that I created also from the Thrive.com as a satellite for parents like me. I have a 9-year-old who still is not potty trained, still is considered nonverbal, and I like to call him soon to be potty trained and soon to be verbal because I'm the ever optimist, and I'm going to see those things happen. I know I am. And You Are United is for, I never thought there was a place for the parents that eclipse the 5-year-old, oh, let's get them into kindergarten with an aid was sort of the goal. But then there's this deep fall off in places that you could go to, like find the bigger diapers, for example, or just have a really bad day among parents that could really relate to that reality instead of the reality of, oh, my son stopped reading as well or something. It's just a completely different situation, and You Are United is more for those parents who have more involved children and would have been considered non-responders until they look at this and see that they're soon to be responders. Okay, third, understanding and healing go hand in hand. I have seen so many people, and I've been among them, flounder with all the different things that you can do for these kids, just constantly stabbing in the dark, looking at different dartboards and different places to go, and never having this clear and total understanding of what my job was. I always knew that my son was toxic. I always knew that I needed to detox and neuroregenerate, but I didn't have this clear understanding of it all. And the traffic analogy, which is this, all this is leading to, is going to be your understanding in a way I really feel like your journey will never be the same. You'll be like, now I get it. That's my goal. Understanding starts with the true definition of autism. This definition begins with knowing our children with autism are in a state of toxic overload. If you're at this site and you're listening to this presentation, there's a very good chance you're already on that page. But if you're not, everything that I have ever found about healing children with autism, and I don't mean paying attention to the people who think that you can't heal them. If you pay attention to them, your brain will be filled with the notion that there's nothing we can do for these kids. So if you're going to pay attention to them, then you might as well stop this presentation now and just go that direction. If you want to pay attention to the people who think these kids can get better, the parents who watch their kids get better, most of them believe that underlying all of it is the state of toxic overload. And when they begin to reduce the burden on their children, the symptoms start to diminish. This results in encephalopathy, or what's called chronic brain inflammation. And I love those two pictures because it gives you a really good visual. It's like a one-way street or not, meaning what you want to get into the brain in the way of nutrients and stuff that feeds the brain can't get in, and the stuff that you want out, all the toxicity, can't come out. But we'll talk more about that in a second. Brain inflammation is caused in part by neurotoxin and pathogen accumulation and damage. NICE is neurotoxin-induced chronic encephalopathy or autism, a neurological disorder. Watercolor or Monet, tissues or Kleenex, pain reliever or aspirin. I think what's happened in the world of autism is a label emerged for a cluster of symptoms, and the cluster of symptoms that each child has is completely unique. I have never, ever found a list of symptoms that's the same for two kids, ever. It's a cluster of symptoms, and it's a junk basket diagnosis, which means nothing else seems to apply, so this is the diagnosis we're going to give you. And what you need to understand is with that diagnosis comes, at least in the mainstream medical world to a great degree, no known cause and no known cure. Well, if you're labeling something no known cause and no known cure, there's a complete limit on what you're responsible for as a payer of insurance. The flip side of that is when you have a 3-year-old and you don't get the diagnosis of autism, but they have this cluster of symptoms, you don't end up receiving services. So it's the whole label of autism. I just want you to look at it as a label. And what I'd like for you to do is change that label to neurotoxic-induced chronic encephalopathy, because I believe it's much more applicable. Hey, I'm just nice. Neurotoxin-induced chronic encephalopathy. I'm going to make you memorize that. Neurotoxins include thousands of substances, both naturally occurring and not. Neurotoxins contribute to high total body burden, and that's the name I want you to remember. Total body burden, total body burden. If you can wrap your brain around that one, you can wrap your brain around everything that you're going to need to have your child thrive, I believe. When total body burden contributors are tracked, they correspond directly with the autism epidemic and all other epidemics. And what I want you to think about here is, depending on how many presentations, how many conferences you've been to, you've seen between 2 and 12 people get up on the podium and show this graph where they say, here's the autism epidemic going through the roof. And it tracks perfectly with the mercury. It tracks perfectly with the vaccines. It tracks perfectly with the EMF. Guess what, folks? Everything, not everything, a huge number of things that are horrible for the body have gone up exponentially at the same time the autism epidemic has gone up, and they're all neurotoxic, and they're synergistically neurotoxic, and it makes a lot more sense that it's a cluster of those things than it's any one thing specifically. There's my soapbox. This is a little bit of what makes up total body burden, and I'll actually go over this time. Some of the things that they found have correlated with autism are the father's preconception, profession, and health, especially if he was in computers, construction, or dentistry. The mother's preconception, profession, and health, especially medical careers in dentistry. The dentistry they're associating with mercury exposure. The medical careers they're associating with damage to the eggs because of vaccines. Parents, family, and child's energetic burden or stress. Parent and pregnancy conditions, stress, EMF, nutrition, exercise, including labor and delivery conditions. Fish consumption, it's cumulative, especially during pregnancy and childhood. The larger the fish, the higher the mercury. Tuna is especially high. Dental situations, metal fillings, dental work, especially during pregnancy. Also focal lesions for root canals and tonsils. Exposure to construction and or mold, with the combination being the worst, and that was our experience. Genetic profile of parents resulting in level of toxic burden at conception and child's capacity to detoxify incoming toxic burden. Breastfeeding is the best option, but transfers toxic burden to the child. My understanding from Dr. Klinghardt is this can be bound with chlorella. If you actually eat enough chlorella that your breast milk is green, all of the toxins had been removed. That's a Klinghardt thing. Vaccines and antibiotics, especially number of doses relative to weight of child. This is also true for the mother's pre and post pregnancy. Child's habits regarding food, sleep, exercise, stress, EMF activities. Pregnancy and childhood exposure to EMF, cell signals, and broadband over power lines. That's just a short list. I'm sure it's much, much bigger than that, but those are the ones that I've seen elucidated. But what is making total body burden so high that it creates brain inflammation and sets the stage for autism? Genes are impacted by neurotoxins, which are impacted by genes, which are impacted by neurotoxins, etc., etc., etc. It's just a vicious cycle. And genes are, in really short sort of explanation, they provide us with the capacity to eliminate these neurotoxins. So when you take the level of neurotoxin exposure and you put it through the roof and you make it exponential, and then you add on that our genes have been impacted by neurotoxins negatively this whole time for the detoxification of neurotoxins, it's just this vicious cycle that's getting worse, and it's getting generationally worse too. I'm not a cup is half empty person, but it's actually rather profoundly depressing to think about this one. So we'll move on. Once the gene expression is impacted, the rate of accumulation increases and overload results. But remember the bubble boy who grew out of his genetic mutation? Well, actually, I was corrected at Dr. Klinghardt's conference, and he said, actually, he died. And you know what? In our world, our kids are not dying. Our kids are going to thrive, and they are going to grow out of their genetic mutations. And that's what's going to happen after our kids, after we clean them up. The expression of their genes will revert back to pre-toxic overload optimal performance. And this is not talking crazy stuff. This is talking about the epigenetic presentation of genes. There's the genes, which is the coding, and then there's the environmentally induced epigenetic presentation. And if you really want to understand this, whataboutmygenes.com is going to be where you can read all about that. But it's very, very possible to reverse all of this. It begins before we are even born. This is a little picture. Is the very first picture I had somebody drop for me in a coffee shop. She was so sweet. Trying to demonstrate, because I had heard this numerous times, that the more toxic the mother is, the greater toxicity the child leaves the womb, and then by the time they breastfeed, it's even higher. But as you can see, from 1900 to present, and these are just approximations, but we are just ridiculously toxic now compared to 100 years ago, 110 years ago almost. And our kids are getting about 60% of that through gestation and breastfeeding. It sounds awful, but they actually become like an emunctory, which means they become an organ of elimination for the mother, and it's some sort of hardwired evolution thing, but they just come out very, very toxic. So it happens before we're even born. Antibiotic use for common childhood illness contributes also. And you may want to come back to this and take a little time looking at it, but the bottom line is that part of the total body burden picture is a very high microbial load. And when these kids are expressing illness with a fever and a snotty nose and symptoms, that means their body has stepped up to say, hey, microbe, get out of town because I have enough energy in my system to fight you. And if you allow the body to have that fever and to have that snot and to have the restfulness that comes with not feeling well, my belief is they will oftentimes locate some of this chronic microbial load also and get rid of some of that as well. So whenever you give them fever reducers and antibiotics, you circumvent that process and potentially make the problem much worse. Not that I'm against this stuff all the time, because I'm not, and I'm not telling you what to do, but this is what I believe to be the truth is. When our children's cup for total body burden runs over, they react to the world from a state of overload. And that's what autism looks like. Because of this overload, they wear the mask of autism. Always under tremendous internal stress mask. That's all that is. Most of our children deal with daily exposures that force them to wear the mask. New insults and toxic recirculation require the mask. And what I mean by that is anything new that they're insulted by in their daily activities. And trust me, we are all insulted every day with neurotoxic exposure. And recirculation is anything that has been sequestered or taken away from metabolically active tissue that somehow gets remobilized back into the system to, bounce off metabolically active tissue. You're going to see this mask, is my belief. These exposures can include, and again, I want to be really specific that now we've switched from talking about causal exposures, and what I mean that is the cluster of things that are neurotoxic and synergistically neurotoxic that create the causal cluster pie. Now we've gone into what are the exposures that create the daily symptoms of autism. And they're EMF exposure, stress and negativity, smog and smells. And I need to be clear about smells that I've learned a lot in the last 6 months, about pleasant smells being the opposite. They're actually neuroregenerative. But smells in general that are toxic add to burden. School and ABA, white and fluorescent light, stimulus from any source, food, especially excitotoxins, TV and video. And when I say stimulus from any source, that's going to go more into the traffic analogy, that it just adds traffic. So we'll get into that more. In fact, most of our kids start off the day without the mask, only to adopt it when their daily burden eclipses their detox capacity. And what I mean by that is, if I ask a room of 100 moms or parents when the best time of day for their child's is, as far as less stimming, more energy, more positive, less negative, 90% of them will say first thing in the morning. It's because they haven't been assaulted by neurotoxins. One exception is when electromagnetic field is disturbing the sleeping environment. And now let's stop right there. Electromagnetic field is most probably disturbing the sleeping environment of all the kids on the spectrum. But when it's so bad that first thing in the morning is not their best time of the day, then it's probably one of the biggest contributing factors to their daily presentation of autism. The simplest starting place is to sleep at least 3 feet away from all electrical sources, including the actual line that it comes in. And what I mean by that is you have your outlets, and then you have your electricity that runs behind the wall from outlet to outlet to outlet. That is also an active source of EMF. And it really should be 6 feet is what the biologists say. But 3 feet is exponentially better than putting your head right next to it. And 6 feet becomes the middle of the room. The short list of things to do is turn off your Wi-Fi, get rid of your 2.4 gigahertz portable phone, don't talk on your cell phone in the car with your healing child, and use a headset. And autism has 3 very specific visible characteristics. The first one is neurological deficits from chronic insult. The second is characteristic habits from daily toxin exposure and recirculation. And the third is seeking behaviors designed to create this state. And I want to kind of break these up. And the next slide helps me do that. So neurological deficits from chronic insult can be the last set of deficiencies to rebound and may include diminished IQ, lack of speech, lack of coordination, lack of reactions like sneezing, tanning, coughing, yawning, startling, sniffing, laughing, crying, fever, blushing, mucus, etc. Chronic insult equals chronic inflammation. And when it comes to these lack of reactions, a lot of you are going to go, oh my goodness, I never thought about that, but he just, wow, how interesting, he doesn't do any of these things. And then there's going to be a day after you start taking away some of the neurotoxic burden from their daily life, and you're going to see them thrive a little more, and they're going to start to sneeze, and they're going to get that first cold, and they're going to have green snot coming out of their nose, and they're going to cry when they hit their head, and they're going to get a fever, and they're going to laugh at stuff and startle. Startling is such an interesting one. And you're going to recognize how truly in the tank on neurotoxin exposure your child was, but you're also going to get to celebrate as they come back. And that's your sure sign that neurologically these kids can recover when they start to have these appropriate reactions. Characteristic habits from daily toxin exposure and recirculation, and when he is, quote, upregulating, can look like this. And this is a classically stimming child. He's actually doing quite well here, but he's also stimming. This is what, for some kids, stimming can look like. Homeostasis is what we all crave. The challenge is, for most of these kids with autism, homeostasis feels different for them than it feels for you and I. Homeostasis to them is a slightly high excitotoxin-induced, neurotoxin-induced, encephalopathic feeling. And seeking behaviors are designed to create this state for them. It can be harder to spot, but it can look like this if you were trying to get high off the smells or toxins in the bed. And one of the best examples I've ever heard of this was a child who was flushing the toilet incessantly. And the parents just had it in their head that it was a stim because that's what they had been told by the neurologist. And then the lady from specialfoods.com actually worked with this family and had them put a chlorine filter on the toilets. Immediately stopped the flushing. He was getting high off the chlorine vapors from the toilet. He was trying to recreate his homeostasis of neurotoxin-induced inflammation by smelling the chlorine vapors repeatedly. Stopped immediately when they put the filter on the toilet. When we relieve the stress on their system, they take off the mask of autism and they start to thrive. Avoid, eliminate, and detoxify in this order. And we're now starting to talk about foundational, primary, secondary, tertiary. But when it comes to exposures to the body, to try to get stuff to come out of the body when you're putting it in all day long makes no sense. So it makes the most sense to avoid anything that you can put on your list to avoid. And you could stop right here, you could pause this, and you could make a list of things that you could begin to avoid. A perfect example is when you smell something toxic coming in the windows of your car, roll up your windows and turn on recirculate. Get away from whatever fumey car that was, get ahead of it, and then open your windows really fast to get fresh air in and then close them again. That's a classic one of avoid. Doesn't take a lot of energy, it just takes knowledge. Eliminate is a slightly more active one, and it requires usually knowledge plus money. You start to eliminate the things in your house that are toxic. A very big one, for example, might be the carpet in your home. And then you start to detoxify, which is these different tools that are at your disposal for beginning to eliminate things. Okay, now is when we start to get into the piece of the puzzle and the piece of the journey where I feel very strongly that I have figured something out that's going to help you. And it's this concept of total body burden is made up of a balance between things. And it's that balance that's crucial when it comes time to create the situation for you or your loved one to thrive. And this balance tends to be between toxins and metals, pathogens, energy, stress, and EMF, chaos and genes, and sensory stimulus. One of the most important things I have ever learned is the relationship between these burdens, period. I've learned a lot of amazing things, but understanding the relationship between these burdens has been foundational to me feeling like I could help my child. Total body burden, it started with the Klinghardt axiom, and for those of you who are unfamiliar, Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt is a world-renowned finder of cutting-edge things that help people thrive. You can look him up at klinghardt.org, but for me it started with the Klinghardt axiom, which basically says humans maintain a balance between toxins and energetic burdens. And what he's talking about when he says energetic burdens is our brain is a really efficient computer-like module. But when you have spots on your hard drive that are faulty, that's where the toxins end up accumulating. And those faulty spots in the brain are energetic and emotional in origin, usually. And that's what you need to understand there. Inflammation is the granddaddy of keeping other treatments from being successful, and most of it is coming from stress and stimulation. I think I always had a mother's intuition about stress in general, but I didn't have any idea that just the sheer constant stimulation that my son was seeking was in fact contributory to his overall neurological inflammation. And so there's some video modules that you can look at on that, but really looking at your child's situation, because what's stressful to them tends to be input in general, whereas stress to you is something that you can't process very well. But there's a lot more to do to work on this, but we should keep going. One thing I learned really early on that helped me a lot in my journey with autism was that usually they're talking about not enough of something or too much of something in our bodies. So, and this is just a brief list: amino acids, minerals and metals, sugar, carbs, enzymes, vitamins and nutrients, microbes or bugs, fats and fatty acids. And I just put a list of too little and too much, because bottom line is if you go to these conferences and you look at the speaker and you think, okay, are they talking about too much or too little of something, and which category does it go in, it'll help you survive some of these presentations. Excesses are often used by the body as protection. Fat, cholesterol, microbes, tumors, cancer, mucus, all of these things are created by the body to protect you from something that if it wasn't protecting you from it, it would cause more damage. And the reason why that's so important to understand that is because if you go on some strict diet where you lose a lot of weight, or you take anti-cholesterol medication, or one of my favorite examples of this is the SCD diet, which is the specific carbohydrate diet. If you go on the specific carbohydrate diet, it limits you to monosaccharides, getting rid of the disaccharides, which are thought to be, and most probably are, feeding the gut bugs that are problematic in the system. So what happens when you do the SCD diet, you starve out the microbes and they die off. Well, when you kill off microbes that have gobbled up toxins and debris and all of this stuff, all that stuff comes flooding through the system. So for the SCD diet, if you're going to do the SCD diet, make sure you take a lot of really great binders to bind all that stuff and escort it all the way out of the system. But this is just something to really file away in your head to understand the journey. From a toxicity EMF perspective, school is one of the worst environments, and every data point that requires processing upregulates neurological inflammation. Our children learn with neurological efficiency when they have a single focus. Everything they sense, hear, see, smell, feel away from this focus wastes neurological energy. This is something I learned from futuresunlimited.com. Neurological efficiency is optimized when focus is rotated amongst the senses. And I'm learning so much more about this stuff from Claudia Gordon-Pomaris, unlimitedbrain.com. She's just amazing, and I'm so excited about the progress I'm seeing with my son doing that protocol. Ubiquitous mercury exposure accompanied by chronic mold results in an exponential accumulation of both. This results in an overburdened immune and neurological system and opportunistic microbes thriving and setting up habitats. I think of mercury sort of frying a little path and creating dead microbes, only to be surrounded and covered up and gobbled up by the winners of the microbial race to be the king of the hill, of the heap of microbial toxin debris. And it's pretty much playing out that that's what happens. If you look at this particular presentation that I did with Dr. Gary Gordon, he'll say exactly that. Damaged tissue is where all of this stuff is. But my point here is that all of these microbes gobble up toxins and heavy metals. So if you were exposed to just mercury, your body would have access to its detoxification systems, and it would try to sequester and or detoxify the mercury out of the system. When you're exposed to mold and mercury together, your body is completely overwhelmed by the situation of the mold gobbling up the mercury, then coming inside your system to have a habitat of mold that's laden with mercury. So it's just a completely exponentially worse situation. Like I said before, where on the autism spectrum our children are is dependent on many factors. And where are you on the autism spectrum? When I don't eat enough and my kids are driving me nuts and my mom who acts like a kid is in town and it's like enough of a neurological overloader steps in, I completely shift directions on the spectrum of where I am. And I think we're all like that. And all this is that we want to be going towards thriving, and everything we can do to create the situation for us to thrive as parents is going to help our children thrive as well. Because you go through neurological inflammation on your way to wearing the mask of autism, the mask of depression, the mask of bipolar, the mask of bitchy mom syndrome, which I would know nothing about. How do I get this stuff out of here? When it comes to the brain, there are two specific jobs you must assure are optimized. Brain drain, stuff comes out. Brain uptake, stuff goes in. Getting things in and out of the brain is a huge under-recognized obstacle for healing people. Successful strategies could include pulse magnetic fields, craniosacral. If your child's head were compared to a melon and you were shopping for melons, you would tap the melon and you would look for the melon that sounds ripe versus underripe. An underripe melon sounds hard. Well, if you do that to your child's head, you tap on their head and it sounds like an underripe melon, make craniosacral #1 on your list. Because the odds are so high that they have this inflammation that's coming in part from cranial bones that are just locked in a way that the craniosacral fluid that should be up and flowing around is just not doing that. Tonsil treatment, Klinghardt has yet to see a child on the spectrum that doesn't need their tonsils treated in some way or another. The Omura acupressure for nutrients technique, and all that is putting extreme pressure with the fingernail of your thumb on the middle finger going between the right and left side, back and forth. Lymph drainage, the simplest way to do lymph drainage is have a child sit in a chair and bounce them on a mini tram. Alternating ice on head and heat on feet. The brain just goes, whoa, what's going on here? Head stimulus like the tingler. If you go to neuroregenerate.com, there's a whole example of these things. Alternating right and left movements, neurotherapy, laser, etc. That which causes brain damage with chronic exposure, like EMF, can potentially be used for brain uptake of nutrients if pulsed in for very short periods, seconds to minutes at a time. You know, this was just a brain moment at some of the people at Summit Number 2, Klinghardt and Carlo, talking about using a 2.4 gigahertz phone for a very short period of time to pulse near the brain to actually create the situation where the brain took up more nutrients. But it's certainly not in the go out and try it stage yet. So I just thought I'd share that with you. Chronic strep and swollen tonsils may be preventing your child's brain from draining and acting as a focal lesion. What you can do now, while you continue to test the tonsils as an issue, and I mean muscle test, energy test, because your classic ENT person, either A, can't look inside their mouth, or B, is going to look and is going to think it looks completely normal. And my child's was like that. And then when we got him out, he was like, oh, wow, his tonsils were horrible. You just couldn't see it from the outside. But you can use high-quality sea salt, like Quinton, and warm water in a neti pot up the nose, and a green laser on both sides of the tonsils while you research tonsil removal. So if this becomes a recommendation, you're ready. And like Dr. Klinghardt said, I've never seen a 4 to 5 year old child with autism who doesn't have bad tonsils, and the average 5-year-old's tonsils are more toxic than an adult root canal tooth. And in the world of high-level alternative medicine, root canal teeth are some of the most toxic focal lesions they ever have to deal with. This may be blocking the uptake of essential nutrients into the brain. This is my son in a tube. And what I need you to know about the tube is it can only downregulate the neurological system, downregulate the stress in them, if it's not stressful for them to be in it. My son loves to be in the tube. When it's his nap time, we lay him back, and he loves to be in the tube. And then when he wakes up, he climbs out on that little massage table that's right there. So it's anything that in theory should be downregulating to the system can also be horrible to them if they have it in their head that they don't want to do it. So it's a fine line that you walk with this. But if they enjoy it, the tube can be one of the most downregulating positions to be in because it simulates the womb. And if you can get rid of all the light in the room while they're in the tube, you can upregulate their melatonin production exponentially. This is my son in Warner Hot Springs. If you're going to do hot springs or Epsom salt baths, some of these things with these kids, you just have to keep track of their phenylsulfotransferase enzyme and their genetic mutations. Because for some of these kids, they don't tolerate sulfur well. And my son does well with this as long as we give him molybdenum. If we don't give him molybdenum, then he gets those PST, pink cheeks, pink ear stuff going on. So just if you're going to use the sulfur-bearing things, you got to keep track of their sulfur tolerance, and molybdenum from worldhealthmall.com is a great one to try. Symptoms are a luxury and are only possible when the system has the energy to melt them. Nobody thinks about that. But Catherine tomorrow and I are going to do a bunch of interviews on her protocol right now, and ATP is the #1 thing starting out of the gate to use for these kids, because these kids just don't have any energy in the system. When you see symptoms emerge, it means they have designated enough of their ATP to fight something, which is huge. On numerous occasions, our son has produced a strange flushing of his forehead with a white midpoint. We celebrate his symptoms as they are rarely unaccompanied by improvement after they subside. In this photo, I can tell he knows exactly where he needs to go to be and to thrive. And he's just one of those canaries. I know a lot of people are talking about that now. These kids are the canaries, and there's a whole story with that, but I don't want to take your time now. This is geckoranch.org, where families with autism can thrive, but for right now,